Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 253. That's right, 253, season 5, episode bajillion, episode 40. Just kidding around. Okay, we're back to our regular structure, our regular format. Last week was a bit of an aberration. I definitely stepped out on a limb last week with that. I'm not sure even what to call it. Poem, something or other, and I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad I shared it as much as felt like I was taking a risk by putting that out there. I appreciate everybody who listened and everybody who shared feedback, and if it touched a nerve, was meaningful, hit the right emotion for what you're feeling at this moment, great. That's why I did it. That's what it was intended for. I may come back to it at some point. I don't think in the space of coaching the Bible, because I felt good to express it. It felt good to write it down. It felt good to put it out there, honestly. And so thank you for last week. That was episode 252. If you missed it, go back and listen to We Were Never Meant to Rise Again. And now episode 253. Also want to take a shout out here to my family. This week we are about to celebrate our 11th year, completing 11 years here in Israel, and that is a major accomplishment. Yesterday, we actually hit 4,000 days. Such a weird thing to commemorate, but I thought it was worth celebrating it, at least for a second, because 4,000 days is a lot of days, and 5,000 days is really still a ways away. So 4,000 days was celebrated yesterday. Congratulations to everybody on getting to 4,000 days and getting to 11 years, which is, I think, a major milestone. It's worth celebrating. It's worth thinking about. It's worth being appreciative and having a lot of gratitude at each and every year as it comes our way. Our topic of the week, season 5, episode 40, episode 253, is the art of leading when you're gone. It's basically the idea of leadership in absence. And how I think about it is, as we're now inside the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the 5 books of Moses, and we have this image of Moses standing on the mountain somewhere, addressing everybody. Very different part of the story of the book, of the Bible. And it gets a very different insight and a very different vibe and energy and feeling around Moses, especially because we know that Moses isn't going into the land. And that opening section, I've talked about it before, that opening section of this week's portion is deeply personal for him in a way that I don't think we ever really get otherwise, let's say. As he's recounting the stories here, you're getting a flipped vision of what took place, and you're getting the perspective of Moses in some of those moments. And it's unique and it's different, and it's a different feeling. It's just a different way to see how those things went down. And I think it's fascinating. So let's dive in here with this. A few weeks ago, when we talked about the story of Balak and the prophet Bilam, we talked about the idea of a leader who let Israel live rent-free in his head. He was obsessed, he was anxious, he was reactive, and that actually resonated with a lot of people as to that happening for them, unfortunately, where something lives rent-free in their mind. They can't get it out of it, they can't deal with it, they don't know what to do with it, and it sits there. It's exceptionally negative, and that term, living rent-free, is usually attributed and connected and connoted in the negative. And so when fear gives power to someone who hasn't earned it in your mind, that's the idea of living rent-free. But what occurred to me is that in this week's portion and in the book of Deuteronomy, and in particular here, Moses is actually doing a similar thing, but it's on the opposite end of it. Moses is trying to embed values and morals and behaviors into the hearts and minds of the people forever. And so he effectively is living rent-free in the positive and living on in people's hearts on purpose, but not by hijacking attention in the same way the negative side of that is, but by really embedding those values. So whereas what's happening in the mind of Balak is, and his legacy is very much noise, what's happening with Moses is very much a legacy of voice. And so whereas the first is uninvited, meaning the people of Israel had no intention of even knowing who Balak was, let alone living rent-free in his head. And he certainly didn't invite it, although by virtue of his actions, he encouraged it and created a space where it could mushroom and get out of control. Here, it's very much an intended implantation, for lack of a better term, that Moses is employing and working on for the people of Israel. And that is very much the idea of leading in absence, that doesn't fade away, that doesn't go away, that doesn't disappear, that doesn't end when the spotlight shifts. Because the spotlight is going to shift in our story. It's going to shift to a new leader. We know him as Joshua. And so that's really important from the standpoint of what Moses is all about here. And before we dive even further into it, I want you to ask yourself some of these, we do this occasionally, thought leader questions in this space. Like, is this something you think about? What happens to your voice after you're gone? I was running this morning, and there's a line in a song by Macklemore who, he's not a fan of our people so much, but he does put out pretty good music, and it does work great in runs, where he mentions the idea of dying twice. Dying twice, the first time you die is when you actually pass away. The second time you die, it's actually very morbid because I think about it. The second time you die is when your name is mentioned for the last time in history, which is it hit me very heavy and hard during the run, but what a heavy line, what a power line. And so I wonder if certain leaders think about what happens to their voice after they're no longer speaking, after they're no longer leading. Or does anyone keep quoting you when you're not in the room? So you're the leader of a company, maybe you're the leader of a family, whatever it is, not in a mocking way, in a loving way, but also in a reverential way, in a positive way, as an example, he would always say this and she would always say that, and putting that into use. So effectively, has your leadership become an imprint on everybody beyond the space of you being present, or is it totally and 100% tied to your presence? It's an interesting question to think about. To take that even a step further, and this one maybe hits a little bit harder, are your values, the ones that you've espoused, the ones that you've talked about, the ones that you've tried to implement in your team and in your company, in your family, in your classroom, in your community, are they now the culture, or are they just living inside of Slack messages? And they don't go any further than that. People don't take them any further than that. So I think that's an important thing to think about, leading when you're gone, continuing to lead in some way when you're no longer physically present there. We have this idea in the Bible earlier on. It's not explicit in the text, but it does come up in the story of Joseph when Joseph is alone with the wife of Potiphar. So Midrashic literature talks about the fact that we know that in the text that he runs out of the room. Midrashic literature tells us that he saw the image of his father, and that's what led him to leave the room. And what that means is that his father had left an imprint on him, that in these certain moral spaces, he could behave a certain way simply because it was embedded in his system, and not just some behavior that he learned, but it was core to his essence, to his being, and he reacted in a certain way. And so Moses is trying to impart that here for the people as they move into this next space with respect to Joshua as leader. And so in the first thing that we see in the story is that Moses accepts the boundary, ultimately, that he's not going in to the land. It's Moses, I think, at his most vulnerable, his most open, talking about his own experience. And what that means and what that looks like for him in this space. And in accepting that boundary, he's now able to do the next part, which is now focus on more deeply and more acutely on the future. So that's first. The second thing he does here is he strengthens Joshua. And that's really important, because if it's the case where the leader isn't happy with the successor, and certainly we've seen that in political spaces, I've seen that in communal spaces as well, then it's really not going to work. Really makes for an uncomfortable circumstance and situation. But he's affirming what comes next, and he's modeling for everybody around him what actual support looks like, or what it might have looked like had Moses been able to stay alive with Joshua as the leader. That's what's sort of going on here. He is retelling the story, and this is something that comes up a lot, obviously, with respect to how Moses tells the story of their days in the desert. He tells it differently. The term we've used before is reframing it. And in coaching, reframing is a very core idea in coaching, is reframing. And so here, whereas before it was simply just narrative, here he is imploring and emphasizing the people's responsibility to remember, the concern of the tendency to forget what happened and how it happened and who was responsible, and the stakes if they are forgetful and they don't remember. And so he's not really focused on the facts of the story, because that we already have, and that they already know, and that's been shared over the course of the 40 years in the desert. What he's doing here is something very different, although he's dealing with the story, which is what he's doing is he's shaping what I'll call their moral memory, the long-term narrative of who they are, where they've been, and what they're actually here to do. And so the act of teaching people how to remember their past in a way that forms their future, that's different. It's not just telling them the story, it's telling the story with an imprint on how that's going to impact what's going on in the future. And so he's curating memories specific. He doesn't tell every story, that become lessons, that become the standards, that become the moral guardrails for their future behavior, and where the rituals become anchors for their identity going forward. And so when you're the leader, you don't want to leave, and you can't leave empty. You have to leave meaning. And so there's a lot of ways to leave meaning. And so what Moses is doing specifically is moral meaning. And then the last thing he's doing here, at least that I'm going to focus on, is the idea of the famous section known as the Shema. I don't have a way to translate that for the audience, but famously, there is the line of, in Hebrew, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, that famous line. And that line is crucial to this idea of leading in absence and leading when you're gone, because it's not commandment. This is conditioning. Yes, it is a commandment to say it. Yes. But it's not anymore a focus here specifically on do this, don't do that, which is very much a focus in the Bible before this. This does become a commandment, but he's instilling pattern and not just really the idea of obeying the laws. With the Shema, what Moses is doing is he's trying to get them to appreciate the idea of living it, of teaching it, of repeating it, and then having that ultimately be woven into their DNA, to their system. Because when it's in the DNA, when it's inside, when it's enmeshed and synthesized with the essence of the person's being, then it doesn't fade. It's not simply just a behavior at that point. It's really a pattern that endures. And in so doing, Moses is instilling a form of moral and spiritual operating systems here, where he will live on, because it's not really tied to his charismatic personality and his ability to speak and his ability to stand in front of the people or talk to God even. It's tied to the ritual, to the rhythm, and to the repetition of their behaviors going on. That's a very different kind of an idea. For the leader to do that, so that's intentional. And that's the idea of imprint and embedding. And that's not living rent-free in the format that we talked about with respect to Balak. You see this in the real world, to just use a couple of examples. The first example is a coach that I've mentioned a number of times in Coaching the Bible, someone I talk about with respect when I'm working with a group or one-on-one, a gentleman by the name of Bill Walsh, who was the coach of the San Francisco 49ers, the architect of the West Coast offense. But what's more important about Bill Walsh as a coach, and his book, which I think I have a few copies of here, is focused on the inputs, right? It's called Let the Score Take Care of Itself. At the time in which he left the league, there were so many coaches who had come through his system and were now implementing and working his system in wherever team that they were working. So he taught them how to think and not just how to perform. And that's a very different, I think at some point, somewhere like 7 or 8 or 9 coaches in the league at the same time who were his disciples, his students, who were left with the imprint of him. I had a teacher many years ago in yeshiva who I always talk about as the person who instilled in me how to think. I don't necessarily remember a lot of the things or the day-to-day conversations or the lessons and the lectures that took place in his classroom, but the manner of approach to content and material, to strategic questions, how to think about things, very much came from 4+ years sitting in his presence. I haven't seen him in many, many years, but his presence in that way is still felt when I'm going through something that I'm working through, a piece of material or content or preparing for something, whatever the case may be. Another great example, we've talked about him before also, is Mr. Rogers. Think about how many people he imprinted his values and his ideas and his framework of how to treat and talk to and work with children. It simply wouldn't work today, but it worked when it did, and it's still having its impact and its effect on people still to this day. It's not just simply singing the songs, remembering what I think now would be looked at as the, interesting characters who we brought on the show, but more importantly, the values and the ethics and the ideas that brought to that space. And he didn't do it with force, and he didn't do it with commandments. It was simply just presence and repetition and ritual, and it's stuck, it's imprinted. And that then is basically the idea of leading in absence. And so it comes, like, if you want to think about the underpinnings of this idea, so I'll share with you the work of a gentleman by the name of Carl Weick. Carl Weick, still an organizational theorist and psychologist. I don't think he's still teaching at the University of Michigan. I think he's in his late 80s at this point. But in his writings and his work, he talked about the idea of what's called sense making, which is the ongoing process of helping people interpret their experiences and leaving behind any sort of what you might call self-regulating system. So really just getting a sense. And so he said the following: people don't discover meaning. They create it through the cues, stories, and frameworks that leaders give them. And this is very much what we're talking about here with respect to Moses and Deuteronomy. He's creating a meaning system or a moral system that's rooted in their shared memory. He's framing that moral narrative for them, the reframing of the stories in a specific way. And then he's embedding their identity through the repetition of these said stories, commandments, ideas, even the rebukes. And so you lead best in absence. This is a core leadership principle. When your people can make the right decisions in real time, because you taught them how to see and not just what to do. And so it becomes, fast twitch muscle memory for a person, because it's in their being from the repetition and the embedding in the system of all these different ideas, whether that's a Bill Walsh situation, or whether this teacher of mine in yeshiva, or it's your parent or someone in your community or the boss in the company who is doing this for you and for the team around you. And if you then react in that way, then boom, they did their job. So how do you do this as a leader? So we're going to talk about two things that we've actually talked about before, but just a slightly different variation, which is a leadership echo loop. We've talked about echo loops, which is you effectively just doing an accounting or a review of what's going on internally with respect to the specific behaviors. So here, where you're trying to intentionally shape the culture of what's going on around you with your team, with your people, with your family through language, so that even when you're not in the room, your influence still speaks. That's what this leadership echo loop is. So people don't just remember what you taught, they're going to remember how you framed it and how you taught it. The goal here really isn't to be quotable. It's to be what I'm going to think it's not actually a word, but I'm going to use it here anyway. The goal is to become internalizable. Can you be internalized by everybody else? And then it becomes their words, becomes their being. A number of years ago, when I was doing a lot more crowdfunding related work, I remember going to an event at a community that was working to build a synagogue. And the leaders got up to speak at this, what was called a rally event, to talk to the community about this campaign to raise, I think it was like $1 million. And every person that got up from my sessions and work and my coaching with them, it was like a real pride moment. I actually ultimately had nothing left to say when I got up to speak. I had to come up with something on the spot. But it was very powerful to experience them thinking and feeling and believing that those words were actually theirs. So what I want you to do here as the leader, I want you to identify maybe the 3 to 5 most repeated values in action phrases that you use. Okay, like we close loops, we honor time. We, famously from, I think it's the Navy, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. We close loops is the idea that we don't leave any of the client matters or any of the working matters or any of the communal matters open. We close them. We honor time is the idea that we keep to the limits of the meetings that we are scheduled. We start on time, we end on time, stuff like that. And then tie each one to a specific behavior or standard within the team. And then use them over and over and repeatedly in meetings, in your one-on-ones, in your onboarding, in your feedback loops, and then model them so that other people now become quoters of what you're doing and then step back. This becomes your sacred echo on the team. My wife jokes a lot about the idea of, one of the things that she wants her children to remember is the idea that they should always have cookies in the freezer. And that's one of those sacred echoes. That's a quote that's going to live on for generations. It's such a winner. Think about those things on your teams and in your communities in the more serious environments per se, where that's the case. What are people saying? What are they remembering? What are they thinking with respect to you? And so when you're trying to scale a culture, when you're trying to prepare even for a transition like this, then this comes into use as a real value. The second one is a shadow audit, which we've talked about in different spaces at different times. We're trying to assess your leadership legacy in real time while you're still leading. And so that you can learn about how people are behaving when you're not there. And so Moses didn't just teach, and he observed. He knew people might forget. He knew people might drift. He knew people might rationalize. And so when you, and as a leader, helps you spot where your values are present and where they're not. So you might think the team is thinking and breathing and eating up all the things that you're saying, but the reality might be that they're not. And so what I want you to do is this: pull aside a trusted team member. This is better than simply just observing it quietly. And ask them, when I'm not in the room, how do people make decisions? That is to say, are they following my lead in the way in which I make decisions for the team, a way in which the culture of the company of the team has been built through me, by me, or are they going outside that loop? Then, second question to ask is, what happens in the spaces that I've stepped back from? Like, don't step back completely and just forget about it. You want to find out and know whether or not it's still going the way you want it to go. Because if it's not, then what did I do here? What have I been doing? Why is nobody listening to me? And then, what are the quote unquote language or rituals, terms or behaviors, let's say, habits that are instilled that are still being used that reflect or ignore our core values? And then write down what's showing up unintentionally. It's an assessment, basically. When I'm not there, am I still there in some way? It's not for ego. it's because you believed and you've tried and you've worked to instill a certain kind of culture and frame and moral structure and values and system that you want everyone to employ and use because that works. And then if it's not there, now ask yourself, do I need to reteach or remodel these things? Or am I simply just going to release them and forget about them? Because Moses does effectively release by virtue of the fact that he's no longer going to be the leader, by the virtue of the fact that Joshua is stepping in. But he has embedded in the system so many things, from the moral to the ethical to the behavioral to the ritual to the covenantal, that he's always going to stay there, and not simply because of charisma, but obviously by virtue of the fact of the role that he played in our history, but also by virtue of the manner in which he led and in the manner in which he embedded and taught it and then stepped back from it. So whereas Moses doesn't get the ending he wanted, which is to enter the land and the completion of the task in that way, he does get something else. His voice crosses the Jordan. His ideas cross the Jordan. His values cross into the land. And not simply just on the scrolls and in the text and in the Bible that we have, but deeply embedded and rooted in the soul and the DNA of his people. And in that way, he's not leading by proximity really at all, but by memory. And it's not really by authority, certainly not anymore, but by embedding that trust, that rhythm, and that love inside at the core of. That's a whole other level. And that's the art of leading when you're gone. So if you're in that transition space, think about this. And if you're not, think about it anyway. What would it take for you to leave well? What does your absence say about your leadership now? And appreciate the fact that you don't have to be everywhere all the time for everybody, but you have to be everywhere for everyone when it counts and where it counts. And that's not just now, that's deep, deep, deep into the future. To close it out, as always, with a quote. Here's a quote from a gentleman by the name of Walter Lippmann, who was a writer and a journalist who is given credit for coining the phrase stereotype in the way in which we use it, and for being an early adapter to the introduction of the idea of the term called the Cold War. Walter Lippmann said the following: the final test of a leader is that he leaves behind him in others the conviction and the will to carry on. That's Moses here, and maybe, just maybe, that's where we're all working toward. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. As always, wishing you and blessing you with a glorious and incredibly beautiful and amazing and meaningful weekend ahead. Look forward to seeing you next week.